The year is 2019 and you want to build a Tiger 1 tank in 1/76 scale. Luckily for you, Airfix has got you covered with this, the Airfix Tiger 1 in 1/76 scale. Join me in this video as I build and review this kit and see what it was like. I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and let's get this down on the workbench. So I've had this in the stash for a number of years and I thought it was probably time to get this one out onto the workbench, and the reason why is because you guys voted for it. Well, kind of. It came second in a poll, but it's not much of a kit, so I thought I'd do it anyway. But don't worry, because the one that actually came first in that poll, there'll be a build video on that at some point too soon. But without any further ado, let's get into this build. I have already done a detailed unboxing video where I take a more in-depth look at the contents of the box, including the decals, the sprues and the instructions, so for more information take a look at that one. This one though will be focusing primarily on the build of the model and what it's like as a kit. I'll put a list of the products I used during this build on the screen now to give you an idea of the kind of things you might want to go and get if you fancy having a go for this one for yourself. As usual, I'll be cutting away the parts from the sprue using my cutters and then sanding away any flash or rough areas with my sanding stick or a sharp knife. This is a vintage classic kit, so there are going to be some areas that need cleaning up. I'm using Tamiya extra thin cement as my glue of choice during this build, and the first step was to assemble the running wheels. Some of the wheels come in a number of parts and they have to be glued together. Once you've done that, you should have a selection of wheels ready to be added to your model. First up was the installation of the sprocket into the side of the chassis. This was followed by the return wheel at the other end. There is actually a specific order that you must follow in order to install your running wheels, and I hadn't followed it. So actually I had to take the sprocket out and then insert the road wheels. They need to go in first, otherwise they don't fit. But I won't add the wheels yet because I actually want to paint them, so I'll add them a little bit later and instead focus on the hull of the tank. The hull of the tank pretty much comes as a box construction where you have to glue the sides onto the top part of the tank. Once that's done, the side of the chassis can then be glued in as well. And whilst the fit of the parts is generally okay, there are some gaps, but some of them are underneath the tank and won't be seen when it's finished. What I'm pretty sure the engine exhausts are glued into the relevant place at the rear of the tank. And then I progressed on to assembling the turret. The top of the turret gets glued onto the lower sides, and in real life I think this was one single piece of rolled metal, but here they come as separate parts. Having added the lower part to the turret, I then flipped it over and glued in place the hatches. I'm pretty sure you could glue the hatches in an open position if you wanted to, but I decided to glue mine closed. There's this strange pin-like part which goes at the back of the turret. Eagle-eyed viewers might be able to realise that there is a storage bin missing from this kit. Typically, the Tiger would have had a storage bin at the rear of the turret, and this is not included. I then added the front of the turret, and I believe that this has an element of play value where it can pivot, but I don't think that's a particularly realistic expectation of the kit, and I just glued mine in place. This was then followed by installing the main gun, and I moved back to the main hull of the tank to add some more hatches. There are some smaller details on the hull of the tank that need to be added here as well, including one particularly massively overscale machine gun. I decided it would be nice to drill out the main gun barrel, so I used a small drill bit to do this. And with that done, it's now time to prime. As is quite typical, I'm going to be using the No. 1 grey spray primer from Humbrol, and this was applied in a few even coats onto all of the plastic parts, which have been assembled or are about to be added to the model. This primer will act as a good key for the next couple of layers which I'm going to add to the model. And speaking of the next layers, I'm going to be using this Revell No. 17 Africa Brown enamel paint. I haven't used enamels for a while and it'd be nice to get this one out of my stash. I thinned it down with some Humbrol enamel thinners and then painted it over the entire tank assembly. A number of thin coats would be needed, and the increased drying time must be observed in order to allow the paint to cure fully. I'd also give all of the other parts not yet added to the model a coat of this paint as well. Next up, I mixed some gunmetal and red paint together to give a more rusty kind of metal shade, and this was carefully painted onto the engine exhausts once the yellow paint had dried. This was a little fiddly, and it might have been easier to do this without the parts on the model, but I just persevered. I also gave the spare tracks, which need to be mounted to the front of the tank, a coat of this paint too. This kit comes with rubber band tracks, and again these also received a coat of this rusty metallic paint. The rims or tyres of the running wheels were given a coat of black paint, which was carefully applied with a fine brush. I then began the very tedious step of gluing all of the running wheels into place. Now I think that when Airfix designed this kit back in the 60s, there was the intention to have this with running wheels so they rotated freely and had this play value, but I don't think that's likely to occur with my particular tank here today. So I'm just going to glue everything together. This was a slightly fiddly step and I didn't really enjoy it. Everything has to be joined onto the model in a particular order, and some areas had to have their holes opened up just to make sure that they would fit. The tolerances on this aren't particularly great. I then scraped away some of the paint so that I had a good surface to glue on the front spare tracks. And when that was done, I gave the entire model a coat of satin varnish as preparation for the decals. A nice smooth surface should help the decals settle down without any silvering. And speaking of the decals, you get a small decal sheet which has been made by Cartograph and are printed to a very good quality, and you get the choice of two different paint schemes. I've decided to go for the desert version, but there is a more camouflage version as used in Normandy also included in the box. Naturally though, you only get one kit, so I'll put those other transfers away as spares. I soaked the decals in warm water to allow them to separate from the backing paper, and then using Humbrol Decal Fix as my setting solution, the decals were applied to the model, some Decal Fix also brushed onto the decals, and they were left to soften and stick to the plastic. This step is relatively straightforward as there is only a small number of transfers. And once that was done and they had cured, the entire tank was again given another coat of varnish, which will help to protect the transfers from the next stages of the build. I thinned down the Humbrol blue-grey enamel wash with some enamel thinners, and then this was painted over the entire model with the intention of making it look a little bit dirtier, but also bringing out some of those details. This wash should run into the recessed areas and add some contrast. Excess wash was then removed using some white spirit, which has been soaked into a cotton bud. Gently removing the excess wash from the model helps to bring back the more vibrant yellow underneath and make it appear a little cleaner. So now we're moving on to the rubber band tracks, and one of the best ways I've found to join these together is by using my soldering iron. Having taped them down onto a piece of wood, the soldering iron was used to melt the pins which retain the parts. And with that done, they were then carefully installed onto the model, taking care of course to get them the right way round. The turret of the tank can then be added onto the top, and the final step was to apply a matte varnish coat to help dull down the shine from the previous satin layers. And with that, I think I could probably call this tank done. Well, at the very least, it's done to a very basic standard. I think this would be classed as an out-of-the-box model, as per the instructions. Naturally, you're probably thinking to yourself, but Matt, it doesn't look quite right. It doesn't quite look like a Tiger one. And yes, you would be right. There are a number of things missing. For example, the stowage bin on the back, which I've already mentioned, isn't there. There should be one there. Also, there should be some front hull plating just over the top of the tracks, but again that is missing, as well as numerous other small details, and the fact as well that the details that are present do seem to be massively overscale. So for a basic build, this wasn't too bad. I found the tracks and the wheels to be the worst part of it, but for something simple to construct, it's not terrible. If you did want to improve this kit, however, I'd suggest going and taking a look at one of our friends. Shuttle Factory Scale Models has actually built this exact same kit, but upgraded it to include the majority of the parts that are missing. Shuttle Factory Scale Models is a very talented scale modeler here on YouTube who does enjoy to build things quite the old-fashioned way, using a paintbrush and scratch building those extra details. So why not pop over and check out that particular video on the Tiger 1 that they've built to find out all the different ways that you could improve this kit further. For me though, I'm not too fussed about improving this kit. I mean, it is missing some stuff after all. And I had heard a rumour, obviously it's probably just a rumour, but supposedly, and this would be a fun story, but again, probably not true, that apparently when the Airfix team in the 60s were designing this kit, they took their references from a real life example of a Tiger, which unfortunately was being used as a display piece and had many elements removed. Perhaps they were taken for spares for other machines, or they simply were removed for scrap purposes, which could go some way to explaining why they don't have the elements that they don't have on this particular model kit, or perhaps things were just missed during the construction or design of this model. On the whole, it's not the best Tiger 1 out there, and I think maybe we should embrace these small problems and do something a little different with it. So let's turn it into an abandoned diorama. The first step is to find a suitable base. For this, I've got these black painted coasters, which I found in a home hardware shop. Using some generic household filler, I added some Humbrol 99 Lemon to it, and then gave it a good mix. It was a little bit vibrant, so I added some generic brown paint from Hobbycraft. Once I'd got the shade of sand that I was kind of looking for, it was then spread out onto my little coaster base. And whilst it was still wet, I pushed in a couple of rocks I found in my garden. For the tank, I want to make it look a little more damaged, so I cut the tracks on one side of the tank and then pressed it into the base, applying some super glue to help it stay where I wanted it. The rocks were then given a light coat of some Tamiya XF60 dark yellow to make them look a little bit more realistic for the scale. To add further damage to the Tiger, I got my soldering iron out again and then started adding damage in various places. I melted the plastic to make it look as though it perhaps had suffered weathering over the years and the metal had degraded, or perhaps it's damage from when it was used in conflict, and maybe it's been abandoned and left for a very long time. I thinned down this Humbrol enamel rust wash with some enamel thinners and then painted it over the entire tank. And whilst it does give a good basis, particularly in a good base colour kind of way, it isn't rusty enough for my liking. So what I've got here is some dirty down rust. And this is a product I managed to purchase with the generous support of my Model Club members over on Patreon and here on YouTube. A massive thanks to these guys on screen for the extra support they give the channel. If you'd like to join them, take a look at the links in the description to find out more. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome the latest members to the club. They are Simon Lund, Chris Bogle, Joe Olmo, Dave Bosworth and Seamus McNeil. Welcome to the club. So this dirty down rust paint has to be given a good thorough mixing. If you don't mix it enough, it won't activate correctly. This was then painted onto the model in all of the relevant areas I thought needed extra rusting up. It is water based and it can be reactivated using water. So if it doesn't look quite right, I can go back and change it. It can also be thinned down with water and applied as a much thinner kind of paint. Having done that, I think it's time to add some extras. What I've got here are some 3D printed fuel cans. These have simply been given a coat of the Dirty Down Rust, which I've just been using. I also 3D printed a small tree, and this was glued into place around the rocks. This tree has been suitably painted with some dark and light greys, to give the impression that it's probably not survived the desert too well. I then mixed up some PVA glue with the Tamiya Dark Yellow, and this was applied over the entire base where I wanted the sand to go. For the sand, I'm trying something I've not used before, and it's this All Game Terrain scatter material. Again, another product purchased thanks to the help of my Model Club members. And this was a simple process, applying the sand all over the diorama base and leaving it to stick to the glue, shaking off the excess and reusing it. To finish the scene, I glued in place some 3D printed figures, which I've also made to 1/76 scale. These were printed out on the Creality Halot Mage Pro, which is an 8K printer and gives reasonably good results. I'll drop a link to the figures and other accessories I've used online if you'd like to look at them for yourself from the various 3D printing websites. These figures had been painted quite simply using Army Painter speed paints to make quick progress to get them ready for this diorama. The final step was to paint the edge of the diorama in black, and with that, I called my diorama complete. So in my head, the sort of story here is that perhaps there's an abandoned tank out in the desert somewhere and these people have gone to visit it. Perhaps one of them has been out a number of times and isn't too interested, but he's maybe the driver and he knows where the tank is. The others are tourists, or maybe even the Airfix team who've gone out on a field research trip to get their photographs, measurements and resources for creating the kit. I don't normally do dioramas and I'm actually really pleased with how this one looks, especially given all of the very simple weathering that I've done. That Dirty Down Rust effect has created a very convincing look to the model. I think though in the future I do need to work on my figure painting skills, as that's an area I can definitely improve. But given the fact that this is not a particularly good model of a Tiger 1, maybe displaying it in an abandoned and damaged condition is the right way to go for it. But what do you think of my build? Let me know down in the comments. As this is a review though, let's of course talk a little bit about the kit. As mentioned, this kit dates from 1964, which puts it in the Vintage Classic range from Airfix. However, the last time this kit was seen in the Airfix range was 2019. The kit does consist of 68 parts, most of those probably were those wheels that I didn't really enjoy building, and it comes with two paint schemes. This desert version and also a Normandy version, which you need to paint with a green camouflage scheme. I'll probably hold on to those other transfers and use them on another project. Back in 2019, I think it was 2019 when I bought this kit, I paid the price that's advertised on the box, and that was £5.99, and I'm pretty sure that that was the recommended retail price. Nowadays, if you wanted this particular kit though, you'd probably be looking at spending a little bit more for it on the second-hand market. And I seriously doubt it will ever make a reappearance in the Airfix range. And there's a perfectly good reason for that. So this kit was last seen in 2019 for its final hurrah. And the subsequent year, 2020, saw the release of this, which is another Tiger 1. I've got a couple of these in the stash and I need to look at doing them at some point in the future. Perhaps I'll use the decals from the other kit on one of these. There are some differences though. This is a brand new tooling which I hope addresses the problems that the original Tiger 1 from the 60s had. This particular version, you'll notice, also comes with some paints and glues as a gift set. And there is one slightly bigger difference, and that this particular version is actually to a different scale. So this one was at 1/76, and then this one is at 1/72. 1/72 scale, of course, being very popular for aircraft, and a tank at that scale gives you the opportunity to make dioramas or fit your models in at a more typical scale on your shelf. So everything sort of works together. People say to me quite often, Matt, why did Airfix make 1/76 scale models? Well, there was a good reason for that, and it's the same reason they now make them at 1/72. It's so that there was a compatibility with other model kits. So these 1/72 scale kits are compatible with the 1/72 scale aircraft. However, back in the 60s, 1/76 was much more popular, and the main reason for that was 00 gauge trains. Now here in the UK, and this will open a can of worms because the model train scene in the UK is kind of insane. 1/76 scale was the 00 gauge trains, and Airfix had their own range of 00 gauge trains, and they decided that all of their vehicles should be to that same scale. This gave customers the opportunity to not only buy the trains but also the vehicles as well, and there was that cross compatibility. You could have your tanks running around on your layout as well, perhaps with extra play value. And that brings me to the other point, the extra play value. So if you're careful with the construction of this kit, you could, in theory, have a turret that moves, the barrel of the gun goes up and down, and even the tracks rotate. I think though, realistically for me, the only functionality that I could see was the turret being able to traverse left and right, because the other parts just weren't going to work for me. I think that's about it for this video though, so I think it's probably time to round this one up. This is an old kit which is very unlikely to be seen in the Airfix range again due to the fact that it's being replaced by a new tooling. This particular kit did have quite a few issues with it, which a skilled and talented modeler could rectify, but in my case I thought it easier just to run with them and destroy the tank a little bit further. On the whole, I'm really happy with how my little diorama has turned out, and I look forward to trying more diorama type projects in the future. As mentioned earlier, thanks to my patrons and YouTube members for being members of the Model Club and supporting the channel. However, if you'd like to support the channel in other ways, there is more information underneath the video. The best way to help support this channel for free though is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. I think the last thing to say though is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time. I don't know why I wrote a book if I forget to look at it when I'm making the video. So this is like an addendum, I'm sure, at the end. In my journal, and you can get the journals on Amazon, I wrote down that I took 4 days to build this one, and one of the issues I actually had was with the yellow enamel. I wrote down here that I found that I needed about 3 coats of enamel yellow for the opacity, but that the thinners, for some reason, even after leaving it for like a day, would reactivate them. So I did have to be a little bit more careful with that one. But I mean, I got there in the end, so that's okay. These are actually different paint schemes. Never noticed that. So this is 332 in the old one. The new one is 334. But this one said that it was from North Africa, and that one actually says it's from Russia. That's interesting. This one does look like it identifies a lot of the issues that this one had. This one's got like extra tools and things on it. First up was the addition of the Sprog. sprocket. For the tank, I want to make it look a little more damaged, so I cut the... Probably do an unboxing on this at some point. This spray paint will give a good base layer for the subsequent The kit does consist of 68 parts, and the final step was to paint the edge of the Other than that, though, I haven't got a great deal of thoughts on this particular kit. If you'd like to get your hands on one of these journals, take a look at my Amazon page where you can find this and other books that I've written to help you on the workbench. And this is actually a product I managed to get with the